Turn on, drop out, and tune in to Buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as...
We're joined today by a scholar and author of a recent book called Drugs as Weapons Against Us. John Potash is a graduate of Columbia University and has spent 25 years working with people with mental illness and addictions, and he's also the author of a book called The FBI's War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders. So he'll be joining us today to speak more about how they are using drugs as a weapon and what that means for our futures. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Sean.
It's a pleasure. I really think this is a fascinating compendium of the various accounts that go back to the mind control MK Ultra experiments that the CIA was doing with LSD, all the way through the 80s and the crack cocaine epidemics, but really talking about how they've targeted, the government has targeted obviously a lot of famous celebrities, musicians, actors. It's quite interesting, obviously, what they were trying to do as far as manipulating our minds. So to start out, I would say, what got you interested in this field of studying how drugs are basically being used as a weapon and what that means by the political class to weaponize drugs?
Well, when I first got out of undergrad in the late 1980s, I graduated as a psychology major, and I got a job as an addictions counselor. And I was also involved in social activism at that time. And so as I started interviewing people and counseling people for several years, I started hearing all kinds of stories that you don't usually hear when you hear someone's life history, such as one person saying, "My father was a Black Panther killed by the police." I started seeing and hearing stories about how the government was connected to the drug trafficking. And then I started finding that, started writing a political novel that turned into the nonfiction book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. I only took a tangent from that when this rap artist Tupac Shakur started getting very famous, and I was finding that his parents were, leading New York Black Panthers, and they were targeted by the FBI's counterintelligence program. And when I talked to Tupac Shakur's New York trial lawyer, he said, nobody's writing about this. And so he gave me a 2-hour interview and described all that was going on that seemed to be a latter-day counterintelligence program against Tupac Shakur, similar to his parents. And I found, after researching that, the same tactics and personnel being used against Tupac as his wealth and fame was added to his activism, as was used, as I say, against the Shakurs and other Black leaders of the last 4 or 5 decades. And so I came to find, for one thing, that Tupac was misunderstood because he was only pretending to be this gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them as part of his Black Panther family's movement across the country to get, first it started in Watts in Los Angeles, to get the Bloods and Crips to call peace truces and turn on to activism. That was spreading throughout Los Angeles, then throughout California and across the country. And so then I found all that, and I found all the evidence of police foul play in attempts on Tupac Shakur's life. And then I was also researching Kurt Cobain, and I read also John Lennon's book about John Lennon's death by a British attorney named Fenton Bressler, who was a London crime reporter. He spent 7 years studying John Lennon's murder and found that the CIA had actually assassinated John Lennon because of his politics and his influence. And so when I started finding all the documents on the CIA's Operation MK Ultra, that put more of a framework as to why this was going on and how this was going on. And basically that operation was using drugs as weapons against us, and us meaning really the 99%, but it was particularly brutal against leftists and leftists of color. And it was targeting activists, especially the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, using drugs as one of its tactics to undermine those two movements. And I show how it was used against Jimi Hendrix, for example, in collaboration with British intelligence, with MI6, because most people don't know that Jimi Hendrix's first manager, a guy who inserted himself into Jimi Hendrix's life when he first made it big in Britain, was a guy named Mike Jeffrey, who said he was former MI6. And people who have studied the CIA understand usually that most people are CIA for life, and they say the same about MI6. And this guy showed all the evidence, his behaviors, his operations, everything he was doing showed that he was continued to be part of British MI6, and he was sabotaging Jimi Hendrix's career. Jimi Hendrix's fiancée Monica Danneman came out with a memoir in 1996 saying that he would plant drugs on Hendrix and get him busted at the airport. And Hendrix knew it must have been Mike Jeffrey. He also, when Hendrix kept trying to play political benefits, like anti-war benefits, Jeffrey would sabotage them. One time he dosed Jimmy with a super psychedelic that messed up his guitar playing, and Hendrix had to cut his concert short, he said. And by the end of his life, Jimi Hendrix had gotten very political. He was very anti-war, and he dedicated his last album to the Black Panthers, and he talked about them in interviews. And within the last few years, his roadie came out with a book saying that Mike Jeffries actually admitted having Jimi Hendrix killed, and that happened within 48 hours of Jimi Hendrix officially firing Mike Jeffrey. So that's just one example of all this. But I argue with Operation MKUltra, there were several goals. One was to hurt the minds and competency of these activists and these musicians who were activists. Second was to get these activists to manipulate them to promote certain drugs, to get the masses to use them and undermine the competency of people that were involved in the civil rights movement, involved in the anti-war movement, or even had the potential to get involved in those movements. And another reason, another thing they were doing with that was the fact that U.S. intelligence documents said one of our goals with LSD, which was the most used drug with Operation MKUltra, was that they found that when people used LSD, it was more easy to manipulate them. And so those were some of the goals of using these drugs.
Yeah, well, it's obviously there is some history of correlating the idea that, for example, Tupac said in his later years, it was 95, I believe, or 96, that he said he promised he would be sitting at the next, in some political capacity during the next election, and he wanted to take more of an active political role. And obviously you do see this trend of a lot of artists who are making political overtures or moving in more of a radical political direction that oftentimes do end up having this sort of sudden death, or whether by drug overdose or murder. And so I think that's an interesting correlation. And let's go back to this, like the origin of it, in a sense, with the 60s, the anti-war movement. You talked briefly about it. How was LSD used as a political tool, let's say, to derail some of the aspirations of a lot of the anti-war demonstrators and the young people who really did feel certain politicalization at a young age? And how did that turn into sort of the hippie or yippie movement and derail them away from politics?
Yeah, well, Timothy Leary is a good example because, as you mentioned in the start, he says, turn on, tune in, and drop out. And that was his motto. And he got so many people tripping and tried to say that was the anti-government way, is to start tripping and just say drop out of everything, drop out of society. And the thing is, that was saying drop out of activism, don't work to stop the Vietnam War. That is what he was in effect saying too. And don't get involved in activism to change, for civil rights, to help, the Black community gain equal rights and voting rights and things they were working on at that time. And the Students for Democratic Society was doing the opposite. They were trying to get more and more students and young people active in the civil rights movement like they were, and active in the anti-war organizing like they were doing. And they became, Students for Democratic Society became the largest anti-war movement in this country's ever seen. And so what happened with a good example with the Students for Democratic Society is the Columbia University Students for Democratic Society, SDS they're called, had the first full campus takeover in the country. It's about 1968 when Mark Rudd and his faction of SDS at Columbia led an action that ended up taking over about 4 or 5 different buildings, administrative buildings and all that on the Columbia campus. That sparked the same thing happening across the country. There was building takeovers over the next 2 years with SDS leading them due to that action. So what happened after that is within about a year, these undercover agents, a guy named George Demerly in particular, was an undercover FBI agent. He said that in a trial, and he admitted that. And so he was pretending to be just an activist who was part of the Yippies. That was Abbie Hoffman's group, Youth International Party, who called themselves the Yippies. And meanwhile, Abbie Hoffman was a great activist around 1965 and 66, and he was married to another great activist. Him and his wife were doing great work together. They had 2 kids up in the Boston area, and an MK Ultra scientist convinced Abbie Hoffman to eat his first hit of acid. And then he started doing bizarre things. Abbie Hoffman, his wife, divorced him. He ends up moving down to the Lower East Side of New York and becoming a big proponent and big role model for eating acid. And he did some good activist work, don't get me wrong, but he also was a big role model and promoter of eating acid, LSD. And so meanwhile, an offshoot, they were heavily infiltrated, the Yippies, by undercover agents, according to lots of reports, mainstream reports. But this George Demerly formed an offshoot of the Yippies called the Crazies. They kept entreating Mark Rudd and his Columbia SDS faction to eat acid. Mark Rudd and the Columbia SDS said, no, it's anti-revolutionary, and we don't want to hurt our, we don't want to do anything that's against our activism. And finally, they dosed their punch at a party, and Mark Rudd and the Columbia SDS said, okay, well, maybe acid's actually good. And they all started eating acid and promoting, the use of acid to kids, around the country. Now, that was the wave in SDS, is lots of undercover agents dosing, different leaders. And I show evidence of that. And Mark Rudd became very disrespected after that. His behavior became very erratic. And
forming the Weather Underground, right? Mark Rudd's group, and they ended up trying to basically bomb buildings and turn to sort of terrorist tactics.
Right. Now, I don't argue that the bombing of the buildings was necessarily the erratic behavior, because that was happening with a lot of activists that had tried marching and protesting and the regular versions of stopping the Vietnam War. And we're having some effect by evacuating all the buildings that they said they were going to bomb, and then bombing buildings that were connected to the U.S. and the military-industrial complex, and the Dow Chemical, who was napalming tons of villages in Vietnam. But what I argue is they were making pronouncements about being so proud of not having read a book in a year. They were making pronouncements about loving Manson and his followers, saying that this is the year of the fork, dedicating it to Manson's followers. Stuck a fork in Sharon Tate's pregnant belly before they killed her. And so that's some of the bizarre, erratic behaviors they were involved in. Mm-hmm. Lauding Manson. And also lauding Sirhan, of all things, killed the assassin of RFK, of Robert F. Kennedy. So, and Robert F. Kennedy was against the Vietnam War, and so he should have been more of an ally. And so anyway, that's some of the bizarre behaviors that happened after they all started eating acid and acting incompetent. Now, I argue that they then cleared their minds a bit and seemed to be getting away from acid and were more clear thinking as they went along through the 1970s to just trying to do better anti-war actions and anti-racist actions. But there was a while that they really discredited the movement with some of those bizarre behaviors.
Well, others that you mentioned, slipping acid in the punch, and others that were accused of doing that were the Grateful Dead during their concerts. Now, what was the correlation between that and other allegations that they were basically working for intelligence agencies when they were doing this?
Yeah, well, I don't say that the Grateful Dead was working for intelligence necessarily, because I don't know that. What I do say, though, is that the first acid tests, people may not know what the acid tests are. Basically, on the East Coast, there was Timothy Leary, who was given a mansion for pennies to rent by the Mellon Hitchcock family, Peggy and Billy Mellon Hitchcock. They were the owners of Gulf Oil, of Mellon Bank. It was really like the wealthiest families in the world, in line with the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgans, Harrimans, and all them.
Everyone from Pennsylvania knows who the Mellons are, right? Carnegie Mellon.
Right, exactly. So they had a big mansion just above New York City, big estate just above New York City in the county of New York, and gave it for pennies to Timothy Leary and his followers. And I document all the MK Ultra scientists that were just hanging out at that mansion, and everyone who was coming up, because all the media wanted Timothy Leary, and the big party at the Millbrook estate would come up and be like guinea pigs for these MK Ultra scientists trying out new psychedelics on them. And so then I show how on the West Coast it appeared that there's similarly MK Ultra scientists who gave legal depositions that me and two other scientists, a guy named John Gittinger, a high-level MK Ultra scientist, said that me and two other MK Ultra staff were at several of the first acid tests. The acid tests were something developed by Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters as just the bigger and bigger parties. And a band called the Warlocks played at all of those acid tests, and the Warlocks changed their name to the Grateful Dead. And so here are these CIA MK Ultra scientists watching these parties, these acid tests, where there's vats full of punch that's dosed with LSD. Like tons of LSD are in this punch. Some people knew there was LSD in the punch, some people didn't, so they were dosed involuntarily. And these acid tests got bigger and bigger. They happened to be held in Watts right after the Watts riots, the biggest riots in the country in the 1960s. Of course, the second biggest riots in the country were probably Harlem. And these same pranksters and Kesey and the pranksters in their magic bus visited Harlem, but just before that, about 6 months before that. And so anyway, they have these acid tests first all over San Francisco, then in LA, and they get bigger and bigger till they become the Trips Festival. Now, on the third acid test, Ken Kesey said, "I don't like this, and I don't want to have any more." So Kesey was obviously manipulated. He'd already been part of the Stanford writing program. You know, he was part of the Stanford writing program. He was a great writer. He wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But he also took part in the Stanford Hospital MK Ultra experiments, where you get paid about $150 in that year's money to try acid. And he just did it because he was poor, and he was actually an alternate to the Olympic wrestling team, so he was not a druggie. But he tried it, and all of a sudden he's liking it. And they're manipulating him, and they give him a job right after that at the same hospital. They give him the keys to the storage area where the acid is, and they pretend like they don't care if he steals all the acid, which he went and did for a year or so, used it and held parties around that area, and the parties got bigger and bigger. And then he befriended a guy named Owsley, Augustus Owsley Stanley III, who came from a super wealthy family in Kentucky, and they hold these acid tests where these MK Ultra scientists, and are present, and the Grateful Dead are playing. So I show that Owsley then became part of a group called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Timothy Leary was also part of that group. That group was being funded by the Mellon Hitchcock family. And of course, the Mellon and Hitchcocks also had a lot of U.S. intelligence members of their family. They were intimately connected with U.S. intelligence. And so that turns into the Trips Festival. Even though Kesey tried to shut that down after 3 acid tests, they ignored him, and the police arrested him for marijuana possession, and he didn't have any control over it anymore. As the acid tests got bigger, it turned into the Trips Festival and had thousands of people after it had hundreds before that. And then that turned into human beings, where there was approximately, people said there were about 100 human beings held around the country. That was 10,000 or more people all hanging out to hear music, but also try all kinds of psychedelics that were being distributed around them. And Martin Lee, who wrote a great book called Acid Dreams, The History of LSD, he also founded Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, documents all this with a number of MK Ultra documents that were found, because the head of MK Ultra tried to shred all the documents in about 1973, but about 30,000 documents were still found in the financial departments. So anyway, the Trips Festival turns into the Human Beings, and the Human Beings turns into some of the first music fests, sadly enough. Even though it's great to hear all that music in these music festivals, there was tons of acid being distributed, and I argued to help people get less competent with their activist work and possibly drop out of activism.
Right. Well, and obviously we know those music festivals are still sort of havens for like ecstasy and MDMA and other kind of drug use that are supposed to transport your mind, but can also be very damaging to the mind as well, as LSD can be.
Right. And so I show 4 studies that show that they found that there's cerebral damage happening with acid. And personally, I tried a half dozen hits of acid in college. I felt like my grades dropped drastically. I felt like I lost abilities I never regained. It took about at least a year for my grades to pick up again. But when you're involved in all that activism and you lose your mind for a year, you lose your abilities for a year, it can really take away from your from being effective as an activist. Because I worked as a community organizer for a little while, and you really have to be on the top of your game when you're going against these powers that have so much more money and so much more personnel. Mm-hmm. And so, so these guys were tripping regularly because they would be, they created a movement and a trend. And when I talked to activists from that time, they say, oh, did you trip in the 60s? And they said, oh, just on the weekends. So they tripped on the weekends. That was their getting stoned on the weekends was eating acid. And sadly enough, it seems hurting their minds with that. So I also show the studies they did on Edgewood Arsenal soldiers. They tested acid on about 1,000 Edgewood Arsenal soldiers, among many others, and they found that even 19 years later, at least 25% of those soldiers said they felt like they had negative effects from that acid 19 years before. Right. So yeah, it's doing some damage. It's doing some harmful things, even though they can't pinpoint exactly what.
So as you mentioned, the acid test being brought to places like Watts and Harlem after rioting, it reminds me of this Aldous Huxley quote about the pharmacological revolution, the idea that basically the last phase of totalitarian takeover of our world is going to be through drugs and other forms of mind control, what he calls the concentration camp of the mind, right?
Right, yeah.
And obviously Huxley bought into the acid and whatnot later in his life, right?
He did. Well, he was going blind, and he didn't have full sight, and I argue that he was manipulated towards the end of his life. He was just struggling over the whole idea of it all, even though he wrote some good stuff about how, against fascism and against the psychedelic totalitarianism, he also wasn't sure where he stood on it all, yeah.
Yeah, I think probably because he was by nature, by birth, part of the British intelligence apparatus and the empire. It was I think it would be very difficult to separate yourself from that mentality and that tradition. But the point being that this pharmacological revolution, the idea of let's transform what used to be sort of a potential brew for revolution and activism and unrest, let's basically unload drugs into that atmosphere, and that beyond acid tests and Watts, you then get the transformation of the inner city, what used to be an industrial societies, in our major cities from Detroit to Baltimore, where you are, to South Central Los Angeles and New York, and the dumping basically of these drugs and increasingly cheap drugs like crack cocaine by the 80s. So how much do you see that as a policy of the actual an intended policy basically to keep the people from unrest?
Yeah, well, what I found, the other chapters in my book talk about the Golden Triangle around Vietnam and the Golden Crescent around Afghanistan, which means they're the top places to grow poppies, which produce opium, which produce heroin. And British and American oligarchs have been fighting over those, particularly the Golden Triangle, but also the Golden Crescent. They've been fighting over those areas for centuries. They had the opium wars against China in the mid-1800s to control that area, but also to stop China from banning opium in their country. And they, of course, won those wars. But John Stockwell, a high-level CIA, he was a CIA station chief, told me in 1990 after a conference that he was trafficking, he was flying, opium from the Golden Triangle to the United States, and he says that the U.S. continued doing that trafficking, opium up until that they started cultivating it around Afghanistan with their CIA assets around there in the 80s that built up into the late 80s. And he said this in public forums also, and I have this on video. And he said, so when the CIA is bringing so much opium into the United States, it's particularly into black communities, as they say, to quell unrest and create chaos in black communities, but poor communities in general, you can say, and communities in general. Any community that experiences heroin addiction is turned into chaos. But So in the late 80s, it started happening, and here they're bringing tons of supply from the Golden Crescent of opium, which lies at the other end of the same mountain range as the Golden Triangle, it just so happens. And those two areas, of course, had the longest wars in U.S. history. And I argue I show the evidence that's no coincidence. But so they're bringing in all this heroin from the Golden Crescent around Afghanistan that their CIA assets are cultivating. And what do you have to do to make to make demand match supply? You have to promote it. And who do they get to promote it? I argue that they started psychologically profiling our role models. And of course, our role models are musicians. And so they psychologically profiled them. They found that Kurt Cobain fit the bill because he had a massive stomach problem. And people know that a tincture of opium helps solve massive, stomach pain. And he was also a brilliant guy, a great artist. And I show the evidence that he fit the bill, and they got a CIA asset next to him in Courtney Love, and got him using heroin regularly. And they said it was the first time he started using heroin regularly was when Courtney Love started dating him. Now it may sound very far-fetched, but Courtney Love had the most bizarre life you can imagine. Her biological father told me she was a junkie at age 16. A junkie and a prostitute, and she was actually prostituting herself. He says he was an eyewitness to this to the Assistant Secretary of Defense, David Packard. Now, David Packard was Hewlett Packard in the San Francisco area. He wasn't, of course, Secretary of Defense anymore at that time, but he was living in that area. Courtney Love's first husband, James Moreland, said that Courtney Love said she was prostituting to Army generals, sleeping with Army generals in Alaska, and saying that the wars were all good for us, they told her. And she believed it. She was like this right-wing nut, according to him. And he thought he was marrying a punk feminist, left-wing feminist. And so she also was traveling with CIA agents at the age of 16 or 17 years old from Dublin. She brought 1,000 hits of acid to Dublin and then took it over to Manchester and a rising music scene there in the 80s. And that was particularly bizarre, but I found evidence to back Hank Harrison's claims that she was doing this. And he had no idea that these guys that he was friends with were CIA, but he knew they were involved in the government. They admitted to him later. One of them wrote a letter to him on his deathbed saying, yeah, I've been working for the CIA all that time. So it's so bizarre, I know.
Well, she herself, her origin, her father was the original manager for the Warlocks, became Grateful Dead.
True.
Right? And and so he had his own interesting ties to obviously the whole political and acid scenes, and then her mother as well was an heiress, right? So from birth, basically, she was born into a very not an innocuous brew.
A very strange family, and her mother was an adopted heiress, and her mother was sexually abused at an early age, according to her own memoir, Linda Carroll's memoir. I don't know why they all changed their name. Linda Carroll, her original name was Reese. The Reeses were Bausch and Lomb heiresses, gold mine heir. They also were heiresses to gold mines, and Jack Reese, according to Linda Carroll, abused her from an early age, and she admits in her memoir that Courtney Love was probably abused in her child care facility. And Courtney Love says, my counselors, she went to counseling from age 3 on. Linda Carroll sent her to counseling at age 3, which is totally bizarre. I've never counseled a 3-year-old, but anyway, I do counseling part-time for a living also. And so, she's getting counseling, and she's saying that she said her counselors were having sex with her from 3 on, and she was getting psychohypnotic drugs from her counselors, like Tuinals and Secanols, which are MK Ultra drugs. And so I show the evidence that she could have had her mind so messed up, and developed dissociative identity disorder, which her bandmate Kristen Pfaff said, the late Kristen Pfaff, so sadly enough, was given a hot shot at one point and died. But Kristen Pfaff thought she was dissociative. Her biological father, who was a counselor, thought she was dissociative, and which is dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorder. And I argued that she was just manipulated from an early age to be a CIA asset and do this and get, Kurt Cobain hooked on heroin and promoting heroin. And when Cobain found a cure to his stomach problem over a year before his death, and showed that he gained sobriety by a blood test from his Rome coma showed that he had no illegal substances in his system. and all his close friends said that he actually gained sobriety, he's then done away with.
Speaking of Packard, you mentioned that Courtney Love may have been a mistress for him. Obviously, that deals with the computer families, and we've heard stories about how Steve Jobs may have had his most creative insights and developments for Apple because of taking acid. And it's interesting to see how that area, as far as from Stanford to San Francisco, that area which was such a hub of a lot of the acid tests and the beginning of the drug movement as revolution, ultimately does seem to go between the drugs into the internet technology side of our economy. Do you see any connection, or do you correlate at all how that actually could have been a positive outcome, let's say, of the acid experiments and the mind-blowing, sort of the mind expansion that would then take these guys into inventing these digital virtual worlds?
I say no. I say they came from very wealthy families, and they had all that backing, and the idea that the acid is what got them this, helped them build some computer or whatever it was is false. I think that's a study of one guy, and when thousands of other people have testified to the fact that it hurt their minds, didn't help them be more creative. And I think that I live in the Baltimore, Washington area where there's loads of military. And when people tell me they're part of the military industrial complex and they have an insight into what's going on in the Pentagon, they've said, now you've probably heard this before too, that the military is decades in front of the rest of society in their technology. So the U.S. intelligence and the military in general had many of these things. Like IBM had the first computer, for example, back during World War II, and that's how they made the Nazis so efficient at gathering all those names and getting those tattoos on the arms and having the holler and punch cards that Edwin Black documents. Now, they had that, and they were just keeping that from the rest of society. And then here's these wealthy guys that are rising up in this one area, and they help him, or he's got the money to work with them to then let the first computer come out into the rest of society. But I don't think acid had anything to do with it, even though he says it does. And maybe I'm wrong, but I just show so much evidence that the acid really hurts our creativity for the most part, and really doesn't help it, sadly.
Well, there is an interesting correlation then between the notion of the pacification of our society that's taken place, where it went, there was a point when they utilized the drugs to transform us from an industrial, blue-collar, middle-class atmosphere, Protestant work ethic, let's say, pre-1970, to where we are with the post-industrial, digital, virtual reality where we're entering now and at this point in time. The interesting corollary, obviously, of the computers and how they have been able to, yes, expand our consciousness in ways that have connected people across vast space and time, but at the same time, they also may be pacifying us away from physical organization, physical contact, right? Physical communities.
I can agree with that.
What's interesting to me is that, what's your take on, for example, you talk about the political initiative of artists throughout the post-World War II era. Now we come to the 2000s, and you still have some political initiative, and you get people like Dixie Chicks calling out and denouncing George Bush, for example, at a concert, and yet there is no desire for it's almost as though the voice of the artist is not having the impact you would expect. The Rage Against the Machines and groups like this, the Damian Marleys and others, the hip hop artists who have been political, they don't have the voice or the influence that you would have expected, that perhaps made them such a threat historically. Is it just diminished because of where we are as a culture, or are these artists just not as powerful as the ones like the John Lennons and the Tupacs of previous eras?
Well, I think it's two parts. One is they really have done away with some great artists, such as, I meant to give you an example of the best example of the assassination of some of these great artists. Is Brian Jones was actually the founder and best musician of the Rolling Stones. And A.E. Hotchner, Ernest Hemingway's longtime editor, came out with a book about the Rolling Stones called Blown Away, and said that Robert Lashbrook, a 12-year CIA veteran, was in London and just getting acid in the hands of as many musicians as possible. And that included Brian Jones and John Lennon. But in the situation with Jagger, he resisted the acid until '67 when an undercover FBI agent named Schneiderman, or he also called himself Joe, came into his life and he had a party, got Jagger to trip for the first time. The police come in and arrest them too, and so they have him Jagger under the legal authority's thumb, but they also have that promotion of the fact that Jagger ate acid there and the promotion of acid. And so then Jones ends up being under legal authority's thumb also, and they split him from the Rolling Stones by not allowing him a passport to come to their Rolling Stones tour in America. And Jones calls Jimi Hendrix and John Lennon. They agree to a supergroup, according to A.E. Hotchner's book, Blown Away. And then Jones, a guy named Nick Fitzgerald, a friend of Jones, who's a member of the Guinness Beer family, says he was at Jones's place. Jones sent him to the town to pick up a friend. He comes back. There's a party there all of a sudden when there wasn't supposed to be. He goes around the back to see what's going on, and he sees someone being drowned in Brian Jones's swimming pool. And someone pops out of the bush and says, "Get out of here, Fitzgerald, or you'll be next." And he ends up writing a memoir about it, and he finds out that his friend Brian Jones was drowned by several people in a swimming pool. He was murdered. And so that's just one of the examples of how this happens. But there's
An important target.
Well, because he was going to form a supergroup, he was already anti-Vietnam War. He was the most vocal against the Vietnam War. Him and Jagger were going to anti-war rallies. Plus, Jones had talked to Hendrix and Lennon, who were also very political. And if they formed a supergroup and they were all very political, they could have done some really powerful things with their music and their money and their influence for the anti-Vietnam War movement.
I would also think maybe the most political assassination would be Bob Marley.
Yes, and there's not even time to go into the full operation against Bob Marley. But I'll say that you had the first question of how it's brought into today's age. I argue that when they have this kind of power over the media, and I show their power over the media in the first chapter or two of my book, and they have this power. They have a power over trends. They have a power over culture. They also have a power, I show in several chapters of my book, over the music industry, because they bought up most of the music industry, the powers that be, the oligarchs, who are very right-wing. And they can create the trends, and they can control the product, and they can create the things that diminish the power of individual artists and allow them to control the movements and how much these musicians can become influential and make enough money to have the kind of say they want to have. Now, when people like Ben Bagdickian, he was the head of the Berkeley School of Journalism, he wrote a book called The Media Monopoly that outlines some of the way they gained all this power over the media. And he came to find, he kept revising his book because some 16 companies that owned 95% of the media turned into 4 companies or 6 companies that owned 95% of our information. And that's what does some of this. This causes this ability to affect trends in this country, and this ability to say that, okay, this person can become huge and this person can't. And so they squash the political musicians that could become huge because they're so talented, but they don't allow them to become huge because they control the media and they control their, people's being able to see them. Like, a huge part of the population never heard of Immortal Technique, despite him being one of the brightest, most interesting, most political rappers.
Right. What my final question would deal with this issue about decriminalizing drugs, and obviously you've had a lot of experience dealing with addicts over the years. Mm-hmm. Where do you stand on this notion that if obviously there's a political governmental control over the traffic as far as the amount of the heroin imports, the cocaine imports. You've seen the history of it with LSD and other drugs. So if there's this level of top-down control, would decriminalizing and perhaps even legalizing drugs allow for a more grassroots approach in terms of people getting access to drugs, destroying the monopoly, and potentially having any kind of positive effect? Or do you think that the main thing is just being more humane with addicts and decriminalizing without legalizing?
Yeah, I am not sure exactly where I stand on that. I generally would decriminalize because right now it seems like the drugs are, some of my chapters allude to the fact that drugs are being used to put so many people under the legal authority's thumb. And, so that's one aspect of it all, the way drugs are used as weapons against us. But I'll just say one other thing about the way the CIA gets drugs into the communities. The CIA Inspector General admitted in the Washington Post that they said that CIA was trafficking cocaine. And so, yeah, you get all these people under, get them felonies for possession of cocaine and distribution of cocaine and all that. So I think, generally speaking, I would like decriminalization of drugs, but of course I would like people not using drugs as much, including weed, because I've seen too many people develop problems with weed. It's one thing if you're using weed maybe once a month, but people don't seem to be able to do that. So many people seem to develop a regular habit of at least on weekends smoking weed, and sometimes daily, and they don't realize how it's making them a bit more apathetic or just a little bit dumber, basically because they're stoned all the time and a little less sharp. I mean, Tupac, that I argue that they manipulated him to promote weed, but when he was sobering up and getting away from weed, they did him in. But he worked past that, getting stoned to keep working so hard. But of course, he wasn't at his best when he was so stoned all the time. And people just think, oh, well, he did so many incredible things when he was stoned, but, he happened to be a intellectual prodigy. And so when he was getting away from weed, he was going to be getting better,
Well, I think that's a good point then, the idea that decriminalization is an important aspect to lay off the fact of the users themselves who are basically feeding our massive criminal justice system, right, and our mass prison industrial economy.
Yeah, prisons, yeah.
Without necessarily promoting the legalization of drugs, which I understand would be difficult from giving your experience for you to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of neutral about the legalization. Even though, as I say, yeah, I mean, it's if they were legal, as long as people didn't use them as much, I'd be happier, So I don't know exactly where I stand on that exactly.
Yeah. Well, John, thanks so much for joining us and speaking. Where can people find more about your work and about whatever articles you're putting out?
Well, thanks again so much for having me, Sean. It's great talking to you. My website's is www.johnpotash.com, JOHNPOTASH.com. But you can find my books on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or you can visit your Barnes & Noble and get Drugs as Weapons Against Us. So I hope people see it, look into it more. And, I have over 1,600 endnotes documenting my sources, so they can check out the original sources of a lot of this material.
Thanks again for joining us, John.
Thanks so much, Sean. Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Well, there you go, folks. Some insights from an author who I really recommend you read, John Potash. Please check out, if not both the books, then definitely read Drugs as Weapons Against Us. It's really important that you understand how this war is being manipulated. As InfoWars says, there's a war on for your mind. Drugs are one of the main mechanisms by which they use it, and I really urge you to realize that you do not need drugs to open your mind and expand your consciousness. You can get there in natural ways. This is Sean Stone signing off.